Everybody, we're going to wait a few minutes to start here, just so that everyone can join. Hello, and welcome to another installment of our Fireside Chat presented by CTIconnect. I'm Joey DeGrava, Product Manager here at CTIconnect, and today I'm joined by Steve Coran, Chair of Lerman Center's Broadband Practice. Today we will be discussing some burning questions about our wireless operators that they have surrounding topics on spectrum, some of the legislation around infrastructure and COVID relief, and what's to come as we begin this new year, 2021. Since we have a lot to cover, we can jump right into it and welcome Steve Coran. How are you today, sir? I think you're muted there.
Thank you. Thank you. Off to a great start. So thank you very much. Thanks for having me, and great to be with you all virtually. Wish we could get together in person, and hopefully that day will come again soon.
Yeah. So let's first touch on spectrum. CBRS was a hot topic last year. Can you just briefly give us an update on the development of CBRS?
Yeah, sure. So as we all know, the SAS is up and running and has been since, I want to say, January of last year, almost exactly to the day. And there are lots of GAA deployments around the country. A few months ago, the FCC concluded its auction of CBRS priority access licenses. It was about $5 billion in proceeds to the US Treasury. Those who filed long form applications are awaiting the FCC's grant of those applications. There have been two long lists, one shorter list of those applications that have been accepted for filing. And I suspect we'll start seeing grants of those applications as early as next month. And the SAS should soon be able to accommodate the PALs, and off we go to the next stage of CBRS.
Yeah, so given most operators are using it for fixed wireless, do you think it'll be used at all to enhance the mobile network?
So really good question. And, kind of what I always fall back to is that mid-band spectrum is great for mobile capacity, and it's also great for fixed coverage for WISPs. So that's what makes the mid-band sort of the continuing battleground, as we'll talk about a little bit later, between the large mobile interests and everyone else. But let's take a look at kind of the diversity of folks who won in this band. You had about 70 of WISPA's members successfully win licenses, including a couple that were in the top 10. You had energy companies like Southern California Edison and San Diego Gas and Electric, combined about $140 million in auction buy. You had real estate companies, you had cable companies, including Spectrum, Cox, Mediacom, Midco. You had a company like Deere, IoT company. You had telcos like Windstream and Puerto Rico telephone company that also won. Then look at mobile. So Verizon was the biggest winner with 1.9 billion, about 40% of the auction proceeds. And you had Dish with another about half that, $912 million. But T-Mobile spent 5.6 million and AT&T spent zero. And US Cellular spent 13.5 million. So what you have to do with CBRS is kind of put it into the larger context of what other spectrum bands might mobile folks have been looking for. And so if you look at AT&T, well, they didn't buy any spectrum here, but my guess is that they were pretty heavy bidders in the C-band. And I would suspect that the other mobile carriers, as well as smaller mobile carriers, were also big bidders in that $80.9 billion auction, which makes $5 billion look rather small, but it was 280 megahertz of spectrum versus 100 megahertz of spectrum, and a whole lot of other things that make those two bands very different.
Yeah, so the FCC is seeking to free up 100 megahertz of mid-band spectrum to facilitate 5G, and that's the 3.4 area, right?
Right, 3.45 to 3.55, correct.
Right. Okay. So as the wireless industry continues to evolve the networks from 4G to 5G with new revenue relatively flat, do you see another round of consolidation among like small to mid-sized carriers?
Well, I think you could definitely see that. I think one of the big questions is how are folks spending their money on getting their own spectrum in the C-band? And what does that mean overall for their spectrum portfolios? Do they even have enough money to do transactions if it's smaller companies rolling up into larger ones? Or, how are the smaller carriers, whether they are in CBRS or whether they in C-band, what opportunities are they looking for? I would say this about the 3.45 to 3.55 band, though, and I think this is going to be really interesting. The FCC is now required under the Consolidated Appropriations Act that was signed into law on December 27th to auction all or a portion of that band by the end of this year. So mobile wants the rules for that band, which aren't done yet, to look a lot like the C-band with 20 megahertz licenses at higher power auctioned by partial economic area, or PEA. The rest of the world, including WISPA, cable, and other folks, want it to look more like CBRS since it's right next to that band and have kind of lower power county-based licenses in 10 megahertz chunks with some GAA. So how that all plays out in the next months, we will see. We do know that this has to be a priority for the new FCC given the December 31 deadline, because it does take time to finalize rules and service rules, as well as get the auction rules in place. So a couple of other things that impact this. One is we don't think you necessarily need a SAS in order to share the band with the federal users that occupy that band. There can be some other form of sharing that is incumbent informing sharing, which is the word that's been used. Recently, NTIA filed a letter with the FCC where they estimated that it would cost about $13 billion to clear or share the band. So if the CBRS auction, which auctions 70 megahertz right next door, generated $5 billion in revenue, and NTIA is estimating it's $13 billion. First of all, we don't quite know what those estimates are based on, but what does that mean and how does that impact the rulemaking proceeding if the FCC has to raise that amount of money to cover that, which is kind of a legal issue that we're looking at. So I guess what I'm saying, to sort of take your question in a totally different direction of where you intended it, is that we're still sort of shaking out CBRS. We're still sort of shaking out C-band, and we have this new auction coming. how does that affect the secondary market? I think it's really hard to predict whether folks would rather spend money in competing in auctions, or whether they will participate in secondary market transactions.
Gotcha. Yeah, it'll certainly be interesting. Can you talk a little bit about the changes to 4.9?
So yeah, last fall, the FCC came up with some novel rules for the 4.9 gigahertz band. And what they did is they said, this has typically been, it's 50 megahertz from 4940 to 4990, and it's typically been available for licensing to public safety, but it's been very underutilized. Only about 3% of the public safety units have licenses. So there's not a lot going on in the band, and because the rule is the band is currently restricted to public safety, is you haven't seen a very vibrant ecosystem of equipment develop. So what the fixed wireless folks have been interested in is, hey, let's open this up so that it can be shared with other users, but let's not auction it. If it was auctioned, that would be potentially clearing the band, and it would become another 5G or mobile band. I think folks like most of the listeners here are kind of looking at this as, hey, can I get access to that spectrum? Let's not have to share it with mobile. Let's share it with public safety. If we're in there, we can help commercialize the band, help grow the equipment ecosystem. So what the FCC did is they said, all right, states, you have the responsibility of being the leasing agent. We're not going to do it, but your broadband office or your, I don't know, attorney general's office or someplace in the government, you guys figure it out, but you're going to be in charge of leasing the spectrum out to whoever wants to lease it on terms that you define. And in terms of interference, there's kind of an open question as to whether that would be something that the FCC would define, or maybe each state could define on its own. Well, the two Democratic commissioners really did not like this, and the public safety community really did not like this. So the public safety folks have asked for reconsideration. There's a further notice of proposed rulemaking. We expect that this will get kind of a real hard look and will be revisited in the future. I think what WISPA cares about is, let's come up with a model that allows WISP to get access to it, whether it's on an unlicensed basis or a leasing basis. And one of the things we liked about this state model was you only had to go one place to get access to the spectrum. You didn't have to negotiate with a whole bunch of other folks. You might have to deal with a new bureaucracy and folks that haven't necessarily done this before, but they could certainly go to a third party and have them handle all the leasing for them. So we will have to see. But I think something needs to be done here. This band has been underutilized for 20 years, and it's right next to the Uni 1 band, and can be kind of a new spectrum tool for fixed wireless operators.
Sure. So a couple of weeks ago, the FCC took steps towards an auction for overlay licenses in the 2.5 gig band. Can you give some details on that?
So let me back up a little bit. And in 2019, the FCC adopted some pretty important rules that will change the 2.5 band, and in particular with the educational broadband service, or EBS licensees that have been using that band since John Kennedy was president. And for the most part, but not entirely, they've adopted a leasing model where they make their spectrum available to commercial operators, T-Mobile being by far the most prominent. And they lease 95% of the spectrum under leases that can only be a maximum of 30 years and have educational programming requirements associated with them. That was the old rules. The new rules said you don't have to have any educational minimum. You don't have to have a lease term limited to 30 years. Commercial entities can buy these licenses, and in fact, there are some who are out there doing it, including T-Mobile. So it's basically going to look like a commercial a commercial band. The FCC also said, hey, we've got a whole bunch of white space or unassigned spectrum out there. We need to come up with a way to auction that off. So the auction model the FCC adopted is in 3 blocks of 49.5 megahertz, 50 megahertz, and 16.5 megahertz. Those are the 3 block sizes, and that's kind of the way that they break based on the current band plan. So the FCC has said we're going to auction this by county. So that was all done about a year ago. The rules went into effect in April of this year. And just about a month ago, the FCC released an auction procedures public notice. And what this does is this invites public comment on what the auction procedures look like. And auction procedures are really, really important in terms of defining whether folks will have a meaningful opportunity to participate or not. And the best example I can give is the one we were just talking about in the midband with should this new 3.45 to 3.55 band look more like the C-band model or look more like the CBRS model. But here the FCC is thinking about doing something that's totally different than what they have traditionally done for any spectrum auctions. And what they're talking about doing, and it seems to be their preferred approach, is to do a single round seal bid format. That means that you would show up to the FCC on auction day and you would electronically press a button saying, here's how much I'm willing to bid for this particular block in this particular county. The other model is the simultaneous multiple round model. And this is the one where you have multiple licenses available and you have multiple rounds where the price keeps going up incrementally round by round according to FCC algorithms that establish whether the increase is going to be 5% or 10% or some other number. You have to bid a certain amount of activity. When everybody loses their activity, that's when the auction ends. So very different very different models, the single round seal bid versus the simultaneous multiple round approach. Here's what's behind some of the FCC's thinking on this. There's 8,300 licenses. That's a lot of licenses. A lot of them are heavily encumbered and they're not uniform. There are some places where all of the spectrum is going to be available in all 3 blocks throughout the entire county. There are going to be places where maybe only a part of the spectrum and a part of the county are available and the other 2 blocks won't be available. So it's not uniform. You also have a dominant player, and that's T-Mobile that has, by some accounts, 80%, might be more, might be less, of the available spectrum locked up. You have the other major players like AT&T, Verizon, and Dish that don't have any interest in this band. So you look at this and you say the auction is likely to be T-Mobile on one hand and a bunch of WISPs on the other hand. So what's going to be more fair, to have a WISP bidding in a county for a block of spectrum that it wants and only wants that, bidding against T-Mobile? Or would you be better off putting in your bid and saying, here's what I'm willing to bid. I'm not willing to engage in a multiple round back and forth. This is my offer. You may end up paying more. You may end up paying less, but you won't be tied up for weeks or even months participating in an auction and then at the end feel like, well, they were always going to win. So what makes this a little bit more interesting is that one of the FCC's proposal is something they call the either or approach, which is of the 3 blocks in a particular county, you could say, I want block A, I want block A plus B, I want block A plus B plus C, but if I can't get A, then I do want B, but I don't want C, or I want B, but I certainly under no circumstances want A, but if I can get B plus C, that would be fine, but I'll settle for B if that's the only thing I can get. And that allows for some flexibility and alternative bidding that I think would be really helpful as you kind of game this out and do your own due diligence and figure out where the encumbrances are in the counties that you care about. The FCC is also proposing some form of package bidding in larger markets where you could say, I want all 3 blocks and only those 3 blocks in this part of this particular county in a major metropolitan market. So the comment cycle has not started yet. That's going to be a 60-day period that begins upon Federal Register publication. Now, an interesting facet of that is that President Biden on Inauguration Day signed an executive order that basically said anything that needs to go in the Federal Register needs to get a look by the person that I had just appointed to be the FCC chair, which in this case is acting Chairwoman Jessica Rosenworcel. So whether this slows the process down or slows the publication of the Federal Register down, we don't know at this particular moment in time. We do hope it moves fast because we think that the FCC wants to advance this auction mid-year before it does the 3.45 auction that it's required to start by the end of the year. So what we're thinking is that mid-year, and that's why this auction procedures notice was launched very recently, thinking mid-year for the 2.5 band, and then sometime in December or thereabouts for the 3.45 to 3.55 band. So lots to watch out for there.
Yeah, that's good to hear. Can you speak to a bit on the developments of the lower 6 gig? I know that there's a lot that has been talked about there, and just want to fill us in on that.
Yeah, so for this, we go back to April when the FCC adopted an order that had been in the pipeline since about 2018. And it did 2 things. It says, we're going to take this 1200 megahertz from 5925 to 7125, and we're going to make the entire band available for unlicensed operations. There's really kind of 4 segments of that band, which are now called Uni 5, Uni 6, Uni 7, and Uni 8, to kind of pick up on what we have in the 5 gigahertz band. And those bands are settled by or impacted by what are the various incumbencies in each of those, 4 segments. So the FCC said we're going to allow low power unlicensed throughout the entire 1200 megahertz, low power indoor, or what we now call LPI. In the Uni 5 and the Uni 7 bands, and that is 5925 to 6425, as well as 6525 to 6875, we're going to allow standard power use, which is equivalent to what we have in the 5 gigahertz band, but it's going to be under the control of something called the Automated Frequency Coordination System, or AFC. And AFC is kind of like the SAS that we have in CBRS, but it is much simpler because you don't have to take into account federal naval operations and shipborne operations operating off the coast. You're dealing with point-to-point microwave lengths. And if you think about it, it's a lot easier to share with things that go from point A to point B than it is with military boats floating around offshore. So the low power indoor has come under attack by public safety and the utilities regarding interference. And what they're saying is, we're okay if you want to do this with automatic frequency control. Well, that just sort of blows out the whole go to the store and buy your Wi-Fi 6 router from Best Buy, right? Because if you have to build that amount of intelligence and know where every device is, it's just not a very good economic proposition for Broadcom and Apple and Intel, and for the folks who have a big economic interest in that. The FCC is now in the process of standing up. I shouldn't say the FCC. Industry is now standing up the AFC through a multi-stakeholder group that involves a lot of folks, including public safety, including critical information infrastructure like utilities that have a lot of point-to-point links and are, want to make sure that this sharing regime works, that the AFC works. There have been some reconsideration notices filed, or reconsideration petitions filed by CTIA, which says, let's license a portion of the band and move out incumbents. We think this is kind of LTE versus Wi-Fi. There doesn't seem to be a demonstrated need for this. It seems to me to be kind of a nuisance petition. And you have the public safety guys who are saying we need more testing and we need more transparency with the AFC. The FCC has teed up a couple of things relevant to this audience in a further notice of proposed rulemaking, and comments were filed sometime last fall. That is higher power limits for the standard power operations. Right now, it's a conducted of 30 dBm, which is 1 watt with a 6 dB antenna gain. Talking about maybe raising that a little bit. And second, having the use of directional antennas, so point to point with unlimited EIRP to kind of look like what we have in the Uni 3 band. This would be an alternative to Part 101, where you'd have to go through a frequency coordinator. So here it would be wouldn't require coordination through a frequency coordinator. It would require coordination through the AFC. So it would be done automatically. And you'd still want to have professional installation because you want to make sure when you install that sectorized device that you're pointing away from where the interference might be.
Okay. So really quickly, just want to move on, but we do have a question about 2.5 and the auction. And the question is, how can we tell which channels would be up for auction or bid in our area?
Really good question. The FCC is planning to post some materials on its auction website. So that's fcc.gov/auction/108. That's auction 108. There's some materials there already, and they've indicated that they will be putting some maps and things like that up there. Otherwise, there are consulting engineers that can do that kind of work for you, and folks can contact me if they want, and I can recommend a couple of folks that they might want to engage for that purpose.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Mhm.
Let's move on to some of the bigger pieces of legislation for broadband expansion and COVID relief and the like. Recently, we saw $3.2 billion put up for the Emergency Broadband Benefit Program. That's funded through congressional appropriations to keep Americans connected. Can you speak a little bit about that?
So December 27th, as I mentioned, was when the 5,593 page Consolidated Appropriations Act combined with the COVID relief bill, the largest, or I should say the longest bill ever passed by Congress, and was signed on December 27th. And that bill gave the FCC 5 days to propose, to put out a public notice asking for comments on something called the Emergency Broadband Benefit Program. And it stems from Section 904 of the Act. And you're right, it's a $3.2 billion reimbursement program for participating providers who elect to serve eligible households. And I'll talk about those definitions here in just a second. The one thing to keep in mind is this is a reimbursement program. It's not a subsidy program. It's not a grant. It's not a loan. So it does involve a lot of accountability, because implicit in reimbursement is that you've actually spent the money or provided the discount in this case. And there has to be a fair amount of oversight on this. So the monthly emergency benefit is for an internet service offering for eligible households. And it's if a participating provider discounts their service by $50 per eligible household, $75 per month for households on tribal lands, it can go through the process and obtain reimbursement for the discounts it extends to those households. Another component of this is if you charge your customer between $10 and $50 for a laptop, desktop computer, or tablet, something that enables video conferencing like we're doing right now, you can be reimbursed up to $100. And so that is the way the program works. So what is an eligible household? An eligible household is that at least one member of the household meets at least one of these qualifications. It's a low-income consumer eligible for Lifeline service. It's eligible for the free lunch or the free breakfast program, or they've experienced a substantial loss of income since leap day, February 29 of last year. And that can be documented by a furlough notice or an application for unemployment insurance benefits or something like that. Or this can be verified through the National Verifier or the National Lifeline Accountability database. And this applies regardless of whether any member of the household has a past or present arrearages with that broadband provider. So that's what an eligible household is. What's a participating provider? The good thing is you do not need to be an eligible telecommunications carrier. That's written right into the statute itself. But you do have to have been offering internet service as of December 1, 2020. And you need to be either an ETC or meet the requirements for participation and approved by the FCC. And of course, it's a voluntary program that you can opt into. It's not mandatory. You also cannot seek reimbursement for anything more than what your standard rate is. And you also have to track and verify household eligibility through the National Verifier or the National Lifeline Accountability Database or alternative means. You can also rely on a school to verify eligibility for the lunch program. So let me talk a little bit about the way the reimbursement process is gonna work. Mostly by certification, and that is you're gonna have to make a bunch of things, say a bunch of things, probably under penalty of perjury, that the amount of service that you're charging is no more than your standard rate. Certify that each eligible household for which you're seeking reimbursement either won't be charged if the standard rate is less than or equal to the amount of the benefit, $50 or $75, or won't be charged more than the difference. They won't be required to pay an early termination fee, and they're going to be subject to your generally applicable terms and conditions. The FCC is going to conduct random audits, and they do have enforcement authority. We expect that they will rely on USAC and its lifeline resources and tools pretty heavily. And the details are going to be determined through an FCC proceeding. So let me talk a little bit about the FCC proceeding, which we're currently in the middle of. So I mentioned that the law was signed on December 27, and on January 4, Happy New Year, the FCC launched a public notice, and they said, we have by statute 20 days for folks to file comments, and then 20 days to file reply comments, and then we have to have final rules done 20 days after that. So the comment deadline was yesterday. There were probably more than 100 that were filed. They were just downloaded a short while ago. The reply comments are due on February 16th, and we expect the final rules will be in place at the end of February or early March. So what are some of the things the FCC is asking about? And then I can tell you some of the things that that WISPA and a number of its members have asked the FCC to do. So what should be the eligibility and election process for participating providers? The current proposal is everybody files an election notice with USAC, the Universal Service Administrative Company that the FCC uses to help administer its universal service programs, and also file a separate application with the FCC with some very basic information. What should be the process for designating broadband providers who want to participate if they're not an ETC, or if they want to do this in an area where they're not an ETC? So that is a question for the FCC, and understand that the FCC has to provide for expedited approval for those who are not currently ETCs. You're going to need to you're going to get automatic approval if you had an established program as of April 1, 2020 that was widely available, like what you mentioned, Joey, the Keep Americans Connected pledge, or something like what Comcast has with their Internet Essentials program. So that's the automatic process. Otherwise, it's an expedited process. How should you track and verify household eligibility? That's another kind of key point to all this. How should the FCC determine and verify what your standard rates are? The FCC says laptops, desktops, and tablets. What about routers and modems? Should we also, if you charge a fee for that, should we reimburse you for that? Should we use the Lifeline claim system for reimbursement? How should we promote awareness? What should enforcement be? So on and so forth. So WISPA's comments that we filed yesterday were focused on three primary goals. Keep it simple and straightforward. Don't require a whole bunch of documentation. One example is that the law requires that all participating providers have a plan, a written plan to combat waste, fraud, and abuse. So what we said is, hey, let's develop our own model plan. Let's use what's used in the Lifeline service. We added that to our comments and said, if you agree to sign on to the model plan, all you have to do is check a box and say, I certify that I will sign on to the model plan. That way you don't have to write your own. Also, in terms of documentation of your standard rates, say, yes, I am charging my standard rate, and I will keep information on file. So if I'm ever audited in the next 3 years, you can ask that for me, but don't require me to upload that information to you or develop anything new like publicity or marketing type of things. So we're looking to keep this very straightforward and streamlined. Second is make it equitable. Start the date for everybody. So whether you are automatic or whether you are expedited processing, let's not give your competitor a head start on this program. And let's also let you opt out anytime you want to. So for instance, if the payments aren't being processed fast enough and it's causing you to have a cash flow problem and you want to back away from the program, we think you should be allowed to do that. So in addition to WISPA's comments, WISPA has coordinated with other stakeholders. We've talked to vendors that can help manage this process. We're also going to be talking with the FCC on how we can best help them to stand this up. 98 WISPA members signed off on a letter that was filed with the FCC yesterday that echoed some of those high-level themes about simple, straightforward, and equitable. And so we thank you, those of you who may be listening to this, for your participation in the process.
Yes, so there's a lot of questions surrounding the replacement of Chinese hardware and the 1.9 billion allocated for supply chain concerning approved vendors.
Yep.
The reimbursement process, the removal, the destruction of Chinese gear, if that's what they're requesting. Is there any sort of clear guidelines for the rip and replace published anywhere?
Well, the FCC adopted rules in the fall, and it established sort of a pecking order for how folks would be reimbursed. And that has been delegated to the FCC's Wireline Competition Bureau to develop. Now, until the Consolidated Appropriations Act was in place, the FCC did not have any funding to actually pay for the reimbursement of rip, replace, and remove from service the Huawei and the ZTE gear that is on the covered equipment list. So here's sort of the timeline, and this can move a little bit. And this is sort of the best case scenario. So by February or March, we expect that the Wireline Bureau will put a catalog of eligible expenses and estimated costs together. Probably by March, there's no deadline for this, but that would be when the FCC would establish specific application and reimbursement processes. And they need to publish a list of covered equipment by March 13 of 2021. And then the FCC will publish a list of suggested categories of replacements for equipment on the covered list. And there's no deadline for that, but presumably that's going to be either when the covered list is released or shortly afterwards. There could be some delays associated with the change in administration. This is something that is sort of bipartisan, so I don't think that it'll slow down too much. When the Wireline Bureau sets up the process for reimbursement applications, it's a 30-day window, then a 90-day review with a possible 45-day extension that the FCC is giving to itself. So the earliest that this reimbursement process would start would be kind of mid-April, it wouldn't surprise me to see that this kind of moves a little bit over into May and to June as they set up the processes and the portals for accepting the applications.
Gotcha. Okay. So there is a $65 million allocation set for broadband mapping, which includes improvement for the broadband location fabric. We were talking about that the other day. And can you discuss how this is going to benefit, some of our customers and operators out there?
So a couple years ago, WISPA joined up with other trade associations to develop a pilot program for broadband mapping. And the thinking behind that was we'd like to sort of control the process instead of getting stuck with a government imposed solution. So a company by the name of CostQuest Associates developed something they called the Broadband Serviceable Location Fabric. And what it does essentially is it takes multiple data sets, huge volumes of data, address data, E911 data, parcel data, LiDAR data, et cetera, and it mashes everything up and creates a single data set. They then deduplicate things like where you have addresses that don't match, or dots on a map that don't look like they belong where they should belong. And you can get from 80% or whatever percent accuracy to something that's pretty close to 95% from what I've been told. And so we did a pilot program, presented the results to the FCC. They seemed to like the idea, but they didn't have any money to sort of do the procurement process. And so finally, again, in the Consolidated Appropriations Act, that's where $65 million, the FCC's ask, was appropriated for this process. And the FCC has to do this. They can't offload this to USAC. So in the meantime, the FCC has been developing a set of rules called the Digital Opportunity Data Collection. And Congress last March passed something called, last December 2019, signed in March, if I'm remembering correctly, the Broadband Data Act. And together, what they require the FCC to do is to set up a new mapping regime that ultimately will replace Form 477. And I know a lot of folks will be happy to see Form 477 go. What you're going to need to do as a fixed wireless operator is submit polygons into a portal, not census blocks. And that's going to be based on your coverage. And your coverage is going to be based on a number of criteria that the FCC has established based on loading at the edge of your cell, how high is the receive antenna? The answer to that is 4 to 7 meters, somewhere in there. Antenna height, spectrum band, the various things that go into a propagation analysis, including clutter. That's sort of part one. And then there's going to be kind of challenge process and crowdsourcing processes, both for your submissions as well as the broadband serviceable location fabric that will be developed. There were some rules that came out over the summer in July, and another set of rules that came out just last week that sort of finalizes this whole process and sets up the crowdsourcing regime, sets up the challenge process, what the burdens of proof are, what the enforcement is going to be, so on and so forth. A lot of details there that I haven't had a chance to put into a deck yet, but that will be coming, I'm sure. So what's the benefit? The real benefit is that we're going to have better mapping, and better mapping will inform better policy making. And that means that you will be less likely to be overbuilt by a government subsidized competitor. That's sort of the real bottom line. There's a lot of other things that go along with this. Government or broadband mapping is for the benefit of consumers and for policymakers first and foremost. There will be a learning curve for the first 2 times you do this, for sure, and it's still going to be semi-annual filings twice a year. So we're all going to have to learn this together. If you exercise good faith, if you use your best efforts, if you rely on the rules and the tools and get yourself educated, like anything else, the first time is going to be a pain, and after that it should be incremental and should be relatively easy. And hopefully the billing systems will incorporate some of this software into it, so it'll be relatively simple. But we all know there's going to be a learning curve for this, but in the end, we're better off with our solution than having the government impose one, even though the government has adopted rules, but they've been largely influenced by the work that WISPA and US Telecom and other trade associations did when they developed the fabric.
Sure. So you mentioned NTIA earlier, and there was about 1.3 billion that was allocated for, well, 1 billion for NTIA grants, and then another 300 million for tribal broadband infrastructure. Can you share some details on that?
Sure. So this also comes out of the good old Consolidated Appropriations Act. This is Section 905, and it allocates $1 billion in grants for tribal governments to support not just broadband infrastructure, but also adoption on tribal lands, and $300 million in grants. And this is for broadband infrastructure to areas that lack fixed broadband, especially in rural areas. We'll talk about that in a second. The spend has to be done within 1 year, but NTIA can extend it. Why is NTIA doing this? Because they have grant authority and the FCC does not have grant authority. The FCC has subsidized programming authority, just not grant authority. So for those of you that went through the BTOP and the BIP programs, this may sound familiar to you. So what's the timing on this? Well, NTIA is going to be publishing a notice sometime in February, 30 to 60 days after enactment. And then there will be an application process, application criteria, what are the uses of grant funds and so forth. That will be posted in that notice. And then folks will have 90 days to file their applications with NTIA. Then NTIA will have 90 days to either approve or deny the applications. They can't deny you unless they give you an opportunity to cure any defects, and you don't do that. Once that 90-day period is done, they've got 14 days to give you the money. Should not be surprising that you can't use any of these funds for Huawei or ZTE gear. NTIA will continue to have oversight functions and will provide the information to the FCC and to USDA so they can take it into account for their funding decisions. So those rules apply to both programs. Let me talk first about the Broadband Infrastructure Grant Program, if I may. So the only folks who can apply for this is what's referred to as covered partnerships. And a covered partnership is a state or a political subdivision of a state that partners with a provider of fixed broadband service. So this is going to favor those that already have relationships with a state or a county or some instrumentality of a state. Maybe you worked on a CARES Act project or some other broadband grant program and you have good relationships, or maybe you can get those relationships underway right now. A covered broadband project is defined as one that's competitively and technologically neutral, meaning it doesn't need to be fiber, for deploying fixed broadband service, qualifying broadband service, which is at least 25.3, so we're not looking at gigabit type mandates, with latency sufficient to support real-time interactive applications. You file for an eligible service area, which is a census block. Thankfully, they're using census blocks and not some polygon you define yourself, where broadband service is not available at one or more households or business as determined by NTIA, based on the Broadband Data Act map, which we don't have, or NTIA's information, which can come from the FCC's maps. So what's the priority for proposed projects? And this is kind of the order. So the most heavily prioritized project is one that is designed to provide broadband service to the greatest number of households in an eligible service area. Second is projects designed to provide broadband service in eligible areas that are within an area other than an urban area, which is a county, city, or town with a population of more than 50,000, and the urbanized area contiguous or adjacent to that town. The next tier, priority number 3, is the one that is most cost effective, which prioritizes projects that are the most rural. Priority level number 4 is a project that's designed to provide broadband service of at least 100 by 20. And then the last criteria is if we have any money left over and you don't hit any of those four, we'll fund you. So your application is going to need to describe the covered partnership, the speeds and the cost, your proposed service area, and whether you are getting support through any other federal or state program. You can't use the funds to repay a loan. You can't use as collateral for a loan, and you can't use more than $50,000 of the grant to prepare the application. So this might be a really good opportunity for WISP to take advantage of. So that's the broadband program. I could talk for a little bit about the tribal broadband program, but this is one that is $1 billion, as I mentioned before, and it's not just for infrastructure, but can be for affordable broadband programs such as free or reduced cost broadband service, distance learning, telehealth, digital inclusion efforts, and broadband adoption activities. A tribal government needs to be the applicant, but they can subcontract the process out to someone who knows what they're doing. They do need to make sure that you're capable of carrying out the project, that you have the financial ability to do that, and that you have the technical and operational capability to carry out the project. The contract also has to provide for recovery of funds if you don't perform. So here again, if you've got a good relationship with a tribal entity, this could be a really good opportunity for you to be their subcontractor on a project that is funded by grant proceeds from the federal government. And again, we expect that the rules for those, the application rules will be announced sometime in the month of February. And at that point, we can give you a lot more detail.
Okay, great. So looking ahead to 2021 and the new administration, we're really we're all looking forward to RDOF and what is on the horizon as that rolls out. Can you just bring us up to speed on that a little bit? And then there's a few questions both from myself and some of the attendees.
Sure. Yeah, so right now the FCC is going to be, there's a deadline of January 29 for the first phase of the long form application. That's an initial overview and financial projections. And if you're using Spectrum, you've got an upload and attachment for that. And that's due at 6 o'clock on Friday, on this Friday. And at that point, the quiet period ends. The next big deadline is February 16th. And that's when your detailed description of your project is due. And this is the thing that is going to get a whole lot of scrutiny from the FCC staff. And the FCC is under a little bit of heat. There's been stuff in the press that some of you may have seen, blog posts, even Congress is very interested and concerned that a large amount of money went to some folks that have not heretofore had the scale to do that and have not sort of built gigabit networks, perhaps. So the FCC is under a fair amount of heat to be the staff to be responsive to the commissioners, and the commissioners responsive to the folks that appoint them. That's Congress, to make sure they get this right. So the FCC should undertake a rigorous review to determine whether you are reasonably capable of providing the performance that you're proposing in your application. And those of you who are familiar with the application, and this is not my first rodeo either, know that there are a lot of very detailed questions, and we should expect a great deal of scrutiny. The FCC staff is really experienced in these sorts of things, and they have a lot of expertise. They have internal standards that are in place. My view is the process should not be driven by speculation, but should be driven by a rigorous review process that I personally and WISPA as an association believes that they are well equipped to do. The FCC has enforcement authority and remedies it can impose. Just because they like your short form, just because you're a winner, that does not mean that you're going to get all the way through the process. Second part of this is the state process, and that's getting through the ETC process. And I do expect that there will be more opposition and intervention in the state ETC process than we saw, for instance, in the Connect America Fund. So those are some of the things I'm looking forward, maybe not looking forward to, but looking that I know is going to happen. And that is a very long and detailed review process for RDOF. So those of you who may be RDOF applicants, just be prepared to be responsive to the FCC, to state PUC folks, and meet all your deadlines.
Yeah, and that kind of brings up some of these gigabit requirements for RDOF, and what seems to be a big question is, will the FCC test and kind of hold accountable some of the the operators who don't meet those requirements? Is that going to happen?
So one thing that will be required is as a recipient of Rural Broadband Experiment or Connect America Fund or RDOF support, is you will need to test for speed and latency on a quarterly basis and report those results to the FCC on an annual basis. And if you're not hitting the targets, which is 80% of your download and upload 80% of the time, or hitting your latency of 100 milliseconds or less 95% of the time, you could face a suspension in your funding. And the way the suspension works is, depending on how bad you are, that's how much you will be suspended. And then as you move into, as you begin to rehabilitate and your test results reflect that you're not quite there, you will have your support suspension reduced by a lesser amount until ultimately you get caught up. There's also more penalties if you are kind of a repeat offender. And if you're at the end of the 10-year, not just the 6-year build time frame, but the 10-year support time frame, if you haven't hit your marks at the end of 10 years, I think you have a year, if I'm not mistaken, to come into compliance. And then at that point, it can be pretty severe. The one thing to keep in mind is that if you miss a speed and latency threshold, the FCC's remedy is to withhold support. If you miss a build out milestone, meaning you haven't hit your 40, 60, 80, or 100% build out in years 3, 4, 5, and 6, not only is there a suspension of funding, but if you miss those targets by more than 50%, that's when your letter of credit can be drawn on. So the letter of credit only applies to your build out milestones, not your speed and latency testing, but understand that those penalties are pretty severe, and the FCC has other enforcement tools at its disposal. There are some who should say the FCC should do what it can to minimize that risk, and I happen to think that that's what they will do, because their standard is they want to be sure that you are reasonably capable of hitting those targets before they allocate support.
So a question from one of our viewers: would you please review level of House passed for level of credit, or I'm sorry, the level of houses passed for letter of credit level to freeze in CAF 2 and in RDOF? Could you review that? I guess what that implies. I read that correctly.
So would you please review the level of houses passed for letter of credit level to freeze? Oh, okay, for CAF and RDOF. Okay, so the rule in CAF was that every year that you had to hold your letter of credit for the 6-year build time, is the letter of credit would actually increase. So the first year it would be 10% of your level of support, and then it would go up every year. It would actually go up as you are increasing your build. And letters of credit are kind of expensive in like 3 different ways. One is there's a carrying cost. 2 is it shows up as a contingent liability on your books. And 3rd is some of the banks won't give you a letter of credit until you post cash collateral. So if you want $1 million letter of credit, you're going to have to give them $1 million cash, which you may have to borrow, and that's going to cost you even more money. So not every bank is like that, and the carrying costs differ. What we were able to persuade the FCC to do was, once you hit, is your letter of credit will never be more than 3 years. And an RDOF, and if you're a CAF winner, at least temporarily, if you hit a 20% milestone by year 2, you can reduce your letter of credit down to 1 year. Otherwise, it's going to be 2 years. And well, for RDOF, it's going to be 18 months in year 2, 24 months in year 3, and I think 36 months after that, and then it will flatten out. But if you hit that 20% within year 1, then it will pretty much stay at 1 year. It's kind of it's kind of a confusing answer. And it's a little bit different for CAF and RDOF because the CAF benefit only extends to the end of this year, and then the FCC is going to revisit that. And that was done by waiver by a bunch of CAF applicants that we were able to help get that rule changed.
Okay. So we're coming up against our time. If it's all right with you, Steve, I'd like to take maybe 5 or 10 more minutes.
That's fine. Sure.
Just to continue on. I think some of
let's
these
do it.
are important, and obviously to our listeners, if you're unable to stick with us, we can post the recording, and there'll be a survey when you close out if you could do that. So basically, what entities are helping operators with sort of the A to Z writing of the short and long forms? And do they have some resources there?
So a lot of folks are doing the engineering in-house. Some have contracted with engineering companies. If you're doing fiber, you probably know who the fiber companies are. What we're doing for our clients is reviewing the documents, whether it's the initial overview or the more detailed description. Don't come to me to say whether it's right or wrong. But one thing I can do is make sure that you're answering all the questions and doing it in a complete way. So if the question asks for middle mile, are you answering it for middle mile? If it's asking about voice topology, are you answering voice topology, or are you answering voice standards? Well, we didn't ask you about standards here. We only asked you about topology. So the key here is to be concise and precise. And sometimes those things are not always, it's kind of hard to thread that needle. The FCC staff also will work with you, but really important to try to demonstrate upfront that you know what you are doing, because that will give you credibility when you talk to the FCC's engineers. So that's what I would say is I don't really want to kind of sit here and advertise any engineering firms services, at least publicly, but if folks want to contact me, that's fine. I would also say that, attorneys and other consulting firms can help you manage the process and help you make sure that you're giving complete answers and answering the question the right way, even if folks like me don't understand all the acronyms and the technology.
Okay, great. You had mentioned that there was a new FCC chair that was, I guess, interim, just announced, I think, on Thursday. And
Right.
what I think would be a good closing would kind of give us a high level of what we can look forward to, I guess, in this new administration as it relates to some of the topics surrounding net neutrality and privacy. And I know there was an OTARD rule change. Can you just kind of give us that, I guess, sort of overview and what you see may be happening moving forward?
Well, let me take the last one of those first. There was a change in the OTARD rule that the FCC was able to finally get done on January 7th. That was publicly released, and it now extends the over-the-air reception device preemption to hub and relay stations that are located at a customer location. So this is kind of a narrow change in the law, but it could have really important ramifications for those that are looking to put micropops, aka hubs, or relays, point-to-point shots on a customer's home to serve communities that may be distant, or maybe there isn't other vertical infrastructure nearby. I mentioned this in the context of your question because, as I talked about at the top, the sort of hold that the executive order has on kind of new rules and stuff that gets published in the Federal Register could delay the effective date of this rule. So the rule is supposed to be effective 30 days from publication in the Federal Register, but if the Federal Register process is held up for a little while, that 30 days may not start to run for a little bit. So we're hoping that that's going to be a non-issue, but it could be. But that's sort of an effect on just the Biden administration's way of making sure that anything that got kind of done at the end of the Trump administration gets a second look. So a couple of things you mentioned were net neutrality and privacy. These are for sure going to be hot buttons, as they are anytime the administration changes from one party to the next. So I very much expect that there will be congressional and or FCC action on both of these. We could see kind of the whole notion of Title II regulation kind of reintroduced, or maybe it will be something that will be, kind of Title X, which is something totally new that would not be Title II, not be Title I, but something that is actually not trying to shoehorn internet into pre 2000 year 2000 definitions. One other thing to think about is some of the big mergers that we saw happen in the last administration may get a tougher look this time around. So, the T-Mobile Sprint deal. We know that some of the Democratic commissioners were not 100% on board with that. If something like that were to come up again, it might not get approval by either the FCC or the Department of Justice. So, big merges is another thing to keep your eye on.
Gotcha. Okay. Well, I know we could talk probably, I wish we had another half hour, but I want to be cognizant of everyone's time here. And I'm just going to go ahead and launch a poll, which everyone will see. Just if you want some more information, just let us know and we'd be happy to get you as much information as we can, as time goes on. So, that's just about all the time that we can have today. I just want to thank Steve Coran for enlightening us on, these important topics. We'd love to have you back for future fireside chats to delve into all this stuff as it develops. And I also want to thank our viewers who joined us today. It would be a big help to us at CTI if you completed the survey that we have at the conclusion. It just helps us continue to provide great content and to our industry and the many more fireside chats to come. So thanks, Steve, again.
Thank you for having me. It's always fun to do this.
Yeah, absolutely. So just stay tuned and have a great day. Bye-bye now.